Well, hello everyone. It's great to speak with you again today. Let me just say, Bill, that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Today, my presentation is the Tao of the Five Elements, day 5 of the Tao of Joy Every Day. And I'm putting a subtitle on this, Interactions of Nature. So the Five Elements philosophy in Chinese culture is used for a lot of things. It's used in Chinese medicine. It's used in martial arts. It's used in feng shui. It's a part of the culture, and I hope to do my best today to explain how this philosophy can be applied to our own lives and can really be an opportunity to gain insight both into ourselves and to others as well. So I'm going to jump into it here. First of all, what are the five elements? Okay, so the first one is metal. And when I think of metal, I think of its impact on human culture and civilization. It has a huge impact. We use it for tools, we use it to forge tools, we use it for ornaments, we use it for all kinds of things. And it's interesting, that evolution, how that evolution occurred. The use of various alloys, or the discovery of various alloys, really shaped our technologies as human beings over time. And that's something that's very interesting to me. Okay, the second one is wood, which I've depicted here showing a tree, wood in its natural state. Wood is also a very useful thing in human civilization. A lot of our structures have it as its interior lattice. I'm sure you've seen places under construction in the early stages. What you see is often is a framework of wood. Even though you may not see that when the building is finished, it's kind of hidden, but it is that structure that's given to it, to the building itself. And then, of course, there's water, which is often used as an analogy for the Tao itself. We've talked about that before. Derek's talked about it. Bill's talked about it. It's actually a good analogy for the Tao. And then, of course, there's fire. A very transformative thing. Fire is. When you think about science and nature, when you heat things up, the atoms become more active. All temperature really is the speed in which atoms move. And fire, of course, plays that role. It acts to heat things up. And then, of course, there's the earth itself. That firmness that we all walk on. It sustains us, it grounds us, and it nurtures us in a lot of ways as well. So I want to start by talking about a couple of cycles that have to do with these five elements. So the first one is the conquering cycle. And you can start anywhere here, but I'm going to start at the top with fire. And I want to draw your attention to the star in the center of the diagram. And notice that each of the five elements here has an arrow pointing to it and an arrow pointing away from it. So if we start with fire, the arrow that points away from it points to metal. And the reason why it does that, because in a sense, fire conquers metal. If you think about it, what happens when you expose metal to fire? Well, it's softened, it melts, it allows you to form it and mold it. So in that sense, fire is sort of dominant over metal. And then of course we can then go to metal, and we see that it has an arrow pointing away from it, and it points to wood. And if you think about how you cut down a tree, that's often done with an axe or with a saw or with a chainsaw of some sort. Those are all metal tools that will then cut down the tree. And so you can see how metal can be dominant over wood in that sense. Now, if we go to wood, you'll see that the arrow points to the earth. And of course, if you think of a tree with its underground root structure, it reaches into the earth and it draws out the nutrients it needs to survive. In that sense, you could say that the tree is dominating the soil of the earth. And then if we then look at earth, and its arrow, its conquering arrow, points towards water. And this one might be a little tougher to see, but if you think about what happens during a storm surge, when there's an onslaught of water, so to speak, what do we humans do? Well, we'll often fill sandbags, right? That's earth inside of a bag and then strategically placed to move the flow of the water away from where we don't want it to be. So in that sense, earth controls or conquers water. And you might also think of a modern dam made of concrete. Concrete essentially is pieces of sand and rock in the right proportions, mixed just the right way, to give us this hard surface that can contain water. In that sense, it has a conquering effect. And then, of course, we can go to water, and water will take us right back to fire, as it will point to it. And I think it's easy to see how water overcomes fire, right? We use water to fight fires when they get out of control, to put them out. So that's the conquering cycle. But there's another cycle as well, and that's the generating cycle. So what I'd like to do is focus your attention on the red arrows that you see pointing from one element to the other. And again, I'll start with fire. So when fire burns, often it's burning wood, that wood turns into ash, and that ash ultimately becomes part of the earth, part of the soil of the earth. In turn, as we move to earth, you see that it has an arrow pointing to metal. Well, where does metal come from? Well, it's the minerals of the earth that are harvested and fashioned into various metals and metal alloys. So in that sense, earth is generating metal. Now we move to metal. Now this one might be a little difficult to see. You might say, well, how does metal generate water? Well, here's the thing. What metal does is it provides a surface for water to sort of transform into its liquid state. The moisture in the air will condense onto metal. And if you've ever been out to your car on a cold morning and seen it covered in dew, you know exactly what I mean. The moisture in the air is condensing onto the metal of your car. And so when the ancients observed this, bearing in mind that they didn't have a science to explain these things, they thought of it as metal generating water. But ultimately what we can say is metal provides a surface for water to manifest itself in its liquid state. And next we can move to water. And water, as you see from the red arrow, points to wood. And of course, if you plant anything in the ground, whether it's a tree or a plant or a vegetable, if you've ever done that, you know that water is a necessary element that will eventually allow that tree or that plant or that herb to grow. So in that sense, water gives rise to wood. And then, of course, looking at wood, it has an arrow pointing to fire, because often wood makes an excellent resource to burn in a fire. And we, as humans, use that quite a bit. And we see that in, not only us humans using it, but we see that in nature. Fires will naturally occur sometimes. So lightning will strike, a forest will burn down. And that's nature at work. It's not always necessarily man, though often it can be. Okay, so now, putting it all together. The reason why I put this slide in here is I wanted to point out that you'll notice that through these two cycles, each element interfaces or interacts with every other element. So if you take fire, obviously it generates earth, but it's generated from wood. It conquers metal, but yet it's conquered by water. And so that one element shares interactions with every other element through these two cycles. And we could say the same for each element that we go through. Okay, so this is all very interesting, looking at how things in nature interact with each other. But you might say, what does this really have to do with the Tao? Well, as human beings, we're also part of nature. We're a part of nature. And so in some sense, these elements exist in each of us too. And these exchanges of energies that happen when these elements interact, well, we have a similar thing that goes on with us as well. So what I want to start to do next then is I want to talk about primary modes of being. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to list some human traits that might fit well with each of the 5 elements. Now, as I go through these, you'll probably notice that you might recognize all of these traits as part of yourself, regardless of whether they're metal traits or wood traits or water traits, etc. And that's because these are conditions that are part of are traits that are part of human behavior. But I'd like you to do a couple of things as I go through these. One, I want you to think about which of the elements is where I'm going to list human traits. I want you to think about which traits are strongest in you. In other words, which element do you most identify based on these set of traits? Like I said, these traits are a part of all of us, but you might notice that you have a trait stack where you have several traits from the same element that are pretty strong in yourself. And I also want you to think about other people in your life and the traits that they have and what element you might associate with them. So let me just go ahead and start here. I'm going to use a little personification, so to speak. I'm going to put on some human traits and apply them to inanimate things, in a sense. So for metal, I have down here courageous. And, if you think about, when I think about this trait, I think about World War II. And I think about how Britain was able to endure the German onslaught. And you often hear at that time period of people talking about the British steel. And, notice steel, of course, is a type of metal. And that's why I'm picking courageous here, to be analogous to metal. So what are some other ones that we might pick? Ambitious and competitive. Independent. Determined, disciplined, and focused. High morals and high standards. If you think of the rigidity of metal, you could see how this might apply. I mean, you might think of the Chinese coin, right? The idea of having a square side inside, signifying your own rigidity with yourself, and a soft round side on the outside, indicating your softness and flexibility toward the world. But metal certainly makes a good description for rigid morals and standards. Okay, so let's move on to wood. So patient and understanding. So why did I say that? Well, I think of a redwood that stood for a long time and witnessed a lot of things happen, but it's maintained its position over hundreds of years with patient understanding, watching everything unfold, but having the patience to understand it, but not necessarily to interfere. Warm, sociable, and compassionate. If you've ever had a picnic under a tree on a warm day, you might know what I'm talking about here, why this makes a good fit for wood. Flexible and adaptable. Interesting property of wood, it both contracts and expands given different environmental situations. If you ever hung a door, you might know what I mean. If you don't do it just right, under certain environmental conditions, the wood will expand and make the door hard to open. But if you don't make it just right on other environmental situations, the wood will contract, and it might make it hard to interface with the latch of the door. So, good analogy for wood: flexible and adaptable, mutable. Stable and practical. Think about all the things we use wood for: chairs and tables. So I think for that reason, those are good practical things that we use. And of course, stability. Like I said, it's the interior lattice of many of our structures. Generous. If you've ever read the story, The Giving Tree, you might know what I mean here when I apply generosity to wood. That story points it out in such a wonderful way. And if you've never read it, then I suggest that you find a child that you like and sit down and read it to them. You'll both enjoy it, I think. So water. Again, like I said earlier, an element that's often used to as an analogy for the Tao itself. So I have down here diplomatic, which I might have picked humble. Right? Humility is an important part of diplomacy. Empathetic. Persistent and determined. Once water starts on its way, it's hard to reverse it the other way. Intuitive and flexible. It always finds the path of least resistance. And strong, gentle yet strong. So obviously water has a softness to it, and yet at the same time, over time, look what water can do. It can carve things out like the Grand Canyon. Okay, fire. So what are some human traits we might apply to fire? Passionate and enthusiastic might be. Oops. Creative. Now this one you might think, well, creative, really? Doesn't fire seem more destructive, especially of late here in Southern California? We've had some pretty horrendous wildfires. But what I would say to that is I'd remind you that, remember that destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. And that yes, fire can have a destructive nature, but also in a sense it can be creative, in the sense that, well, think of metal alloys, right? Take copper and tin. They're two soft metals. But if you combine them and heat them to make an alloy, you'll get bronze, which is stronger than both tin and copper. So it's creative in that sense, if you think of it that way. Persuasive and charismatic. Spontaneous and adventurous. Warm and loving. And if you've ever sat by a fire with someone you love, you know what I mean. About warm and loving. It can be quite a romantic aspect of life, that activity, sitting by a fire with someone you love. And then, of course, there's the earth. Stable and rooted. It gives us the ground we walk on. Compassionate, caring, and empathetic. Responsible. Nurturing. Think of all the nutrients in the soil, the plants and trees. Grow off of, and then we in turn consume them, either indirectly by consuming other beings, or directly by eating the plants and vegetation themselves. Strong and enduring. Of course, nothing lasts forever, but the Earth and its soil has been here for 4.5 billion years, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. So, getting back to the diagram here of all the elements together, I've entitled this one The Balance of Interactions. And so, bearing in mind these traits that I've mentioned before, you might apply this to your life a little bit. For example, if you identify yourself with fire, enthusiastic, spontaneous, and so forth, think about who might be the water people in your life, the ones who maybe bring you back a little when you get a little out of control. You might ask yourself, who are the metals in your life, the ones that you're able to provide what they need in order to be molded and shaped and be useful. You might ask, who are the earth people in your life where you can be useful in adding to what they need? And you might ask, who are the wood people in your life that sustain you, that give you what you need to keep going? And you could do this for all the elements. In a certain sense, you might say that someone who cultivates the Tao at a high level doesn't have any leaning toward one element or the other, but instead is a perfect balance of all the 5 elements, and that they know which part of themselves to manifest at what time, depending on what interaction. I think that comes with experience and with wisdom and with learning. And so I invite all of you to think about the 5 elements a little bit. Think about the traits we talked about today, and see how you can apply them to your life and to your relationships. It might give you new insight that'll allow you to think of new things that might improve your relationships with others, might improve your outlook, might help you appreciate yourself and others. So I'm going to start to sum it up here a bit, if I can. So the 5 elements, what are they? Well, as we discussed, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. The conquering cycle. Water, of course, puts out fire. Fire, in turn, melts metal. Metal can be used to cut down trees, thus giving us wood. Wood can be burned in a fire, thus giving us earth. And earth can direct the path of water. The generating cycle. Water helps produce wood. Wood is a fuel for fire. Fire becomes ash when it burns wood and gives us more earth. Metal provides a surface for the moisture in the air to condense upon, thus giving rise to water. So both these cycles have to do with the interactions of the energies in nature. Those same energies we see in nature exist within each of us as well. The sage, the enlightened being, the awakened being, the true self, or each of our Buddha natures, in my view, is the perfect balance of those 5 elements that observes and knows which element to fit to the type of interaction that is encountered. So there it was. I just want to add in a book recommendation, The Tao of Joy Every, a great book to use daily to help one study and learn the Tao teachings and put them into action. So there it was, the Tao of the 5 elements, day 5, interactions of nature. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. I hope I said something that was of use, and I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday.
Alex, thank you so much for this thoughtful and intelligent presentation. You've gone into the 5 elements very deeply. I think, especially it would be surprising for, people who come from a Chinese cultural background. We grew up with it, from very little, from a very young age, we're taught the 5 elements, 金木水火土. We talk about this all the time. So we kind of take it for granted So when people, when Chinese-speaking people, Mandarin-speaking people, if they were to hear you get into such details about the five elements, I think a lot of them would be quite surprised. You know, they would be like, wow, you really, how did you know that? But you're not Chinese. How you know ancient Chinese secret, you know, stuff like that. And among Chinese-speaking people themselves, you know, we use it as sort of a fun way to gauge other people. So as an example, Janice is reckoned to be fire. That's her element. And all the descriptions that you have provided fit her like a glove. She's warm and creative and, you know, just don't get her mad, right? Because that blaze will burn out of control. I belong to the earth element, which, by the way, to the Chinese, that's Tu. And that has an association with what is generally seen as country bumpkins. That's because, you know, people who come from this rural agricultural backgrounds, they have much more of a connection with the earth. So when they one day, you know, visit the city, they'll be wowed by everything. You know, there's the country bumpkins, you know, surprised and amazed, which, according to my wife, describes me quite well. So, and the generating cycle, Janice will always point to the generation and say that, you see, fire gives rise to earth. You know, like when fire burns, what remains is ash. So fire gives rise or begets or generates earth, and that's why she's so great to me. So, and I'm like, you know, I will smother your flames with my earth. And she's like, nope, sorry, that's water. Just sit down and shut up. You know, so that is how the five elements are generally utilized within Chinese culture. If you don't know the latest, you know, sports teams performance and games and sports, you can always talk about the five elements. So small talk, you know, socializing. But as you pointed out, when you get into Chinese medicine, it's definitely something that people talk about quite a bit more and quite seriously as well.